In June 1940, as the German army completed its rapid conquest of France, one photograph captured a moment that would become one of the most recognizable images of the entire war. Early in the morning on June 23rd, Adolf Hitler made a brief and carefully staged visit to Paris. The trip lasted only a few hours, but it was designed to send a powerful message. In the photograph, Hitler stands with several of his closest associates while looking toward the Eiffel Tower, the most famous landmark of the French capital. The image shows a confident German leader calmly observing a city that had fallen to his army only days earlier. At the time, the photograph was used as propaganda across Nazi-controlled Europe. It symbolized the stunning speed of Germany's victory over France, a country that had been considered one of the strongest military powers on the continent. To the outside world, the image suggested total control and triumph, but historians who later studied the circumstances of the visit discovered something very different behind the image. Hitler's tour of Paris was extremely short and carefully managed. He avoided crowds, stayed away from large public gatherings, and moved quickly between landmarks under heavy security. The visit was less a celebration and more a staged moment designed to create photographs that would reinforce the myth of German invincibility. The photo itself became famous not only because of what it showed, but also because of what it hid. At that moment in 1940, it appeared as if Nazi Germany stood at the peak of its power. Yet within 5 years, the same regime would collapse completely. Today, historians often point to that photograph as a reminder of how propaganda images can shape public perception of war. The camera captured a moment of triumph, but history would soon reveal how fragile that triumph actually was. Only a year later, a very different set of photographs began emerging from the Eastern Front after Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in June 1941. Unlike the carefully staged propaganda images produced by the Nazi regime, many of these photographs were taken privately by German soldiers themselves. Soldiers carried small personal cameras and documented what they saw as they advanced deep into Soviet territory. These photos were never intended for official publication. Instead, they were often mailed home to families or kept as personal souvenirs. Decades later, historians began collecting and analyzing thousands of these images from private collections and archives. What they revealed was a far more complicated and disturbing picture of the war than official German propaganda had ever shown. The photographs captured everyday moments of life on the Eastern Front. Soldiers standing beside destroyed Soviet tanks, columns of prisoners marching along dusty roads, villages burned and abandoned during the advance. Some images showed soldiers posing proudly beside captured equipment or newly conquered territory. Others quietly revealed the scale of destruction left behind as the invasion moved deeper into the Soviet Union. These private photographs became valuable historical evidence because they showed the war from the perspective of the soldiers themselves, without the censorship or editing that shaped official wartime imagery. Historians studying these images began to realize that they provided a rare window into the reality of the German invasion. Instead of carefully composed propaganda scenes, these photographs captured raw and often unsettling glimpses of a brutal campaign that would eventually become the largest and deadliest theater of World War II. Together, these early photographs from 1940 and 1941 tell a powerful story about how images can shape our understanding of history. Some were created deliberately to influence public perception, while others unintentionally revealed truths that official narratives tried to hide. Among the most disturbing photographs to emerge from the Eastern Front are those connected to the activities of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German army during the invasion of the Soviet Union. One particular photograph, taken in 1941 somewhere in Ukraine, would later become one of the most powerful pieces of visual evidence used to understand how the Holocaust unfolded in its earliest stages. The image shows a man standing at the edge of a pit while an armed soldier prepares to shoot him from behind. At first glance, the photograph is simple and brutally direct, yet the story behind it reveals why historians consider it so significant. During the early years of the war, the mass killings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen were not widely known outside the occupied territories. Entire communities of Jews, political prisoners, and civilians were murdered in fields, forests, and ravines across Eastern Europe. The killings were often carried out far from major cities, away from cameras and public attention. But in this case, someone present at the scene took a photograph. Decades later, the image surfaced in archives and quickly became one of the most widely studied photographs from the war. Historians realized that it documented a moment that had rarely been captured visually: the actual process of mass execution during the early phases of the Holocaust. The photograph forced researchers and the public to confront the reality that these killings were systematic and organized operations carried out alongside the German military advance. It also challenged earlier narratives that attempted to portray the violence of the war as isolated or chaotic acts. Instead, the image showed how closely these atrocities were tied to the broader German campaign in the East. As more documents and photographs were uncovered, historians began to piece together the scale of the Einsatzgruppen operations, revealing that hundreds of thousands of people had been murdered in similar executions across occupied Soviet territory. Another photograph discovered years later provided an equally unsettling glimpse into the mentality of some of the perpetrators. In the image, an SS officer stands near a mass grave while posing casually for the camera. What made the photograph so striking was not only the presence of the grave itself, but the expression of the officer, who appeared relaxed and almost proud as he looked toward the photographer. When historians first encountered the image, they were confronted with an uncomfortable question: why would someone willingly pose beside such a scene? The answer gradually emerged as researchers studied the culture and behavior of German units operating on the Eastern Front. Many soldiers and SS personnel carried cameras and frequently documented their activities, sometimes treating photographs as personal souvenirs of their wartime experiences. The images were shared among fellow soldiers or sent home to families without any expectation that they would later be examined by historians. Yet these photographs eventually became crucial evidence in understanding how violence was normalized within certain units during the war. Instead of hiding their actions, some perpetrators openly recorded them. This revealed an environment in which brutality had become routine and even encouraged within certain formations. When such photographs began appearing in archives decades later, they forced historians to reconsider how the culture of the German occupation functioned on the ground. These images showed not only the victims of the war, but also the attitudes of those responsible for carrying out the violence. Together, the photographs connected to the Einsatzgruppen and the SS provides some of the most powerful visual documentation of how the Holocaust developed during the early years of World War II, offering a stark reminder of the human consequences behind the vast military campaigns taking place across Europe. By 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had reached a scale of destruction unlike anything seen before in modern history. One photograph taken during the Battle of Stalingrad captured a moment that would later symbolize the turning point of the entire conflict. In the image, several German soldiers stand silently on the edge of a devastated landscape, looking out across the ruins of the city. Around them lies a wasteland of shattered buildings, collapsed factories, and streets buried beneath rubble. Smoke drifts slowly through the broken skyline, while the soldiers appear almost frozen in place, staring at the destruction that surrounds them. At the time the photograph was taken, German forces had already been fighting for months in a brutal urban battle that consumed the city block by block. What had once been a thriving industrial center along the Volga River had been reduced to one of the most destroyed battlefields of the war. The photograph became significant because it revealed something that official wartime propaganda rarely showed: the exhaustion and uncertainty among soldiers who had once believed victory was inevitable. Earlier images from the war had often portrayed confident troops advancing across Europe with speed and precision, but the Stalingrad photographs told a different story. The soldiers in the image are not charging forward or celebrating a victory. Instead, they appear reflective and uncertain, as if realizing that the war they had expected to win quickly had turned into something far more dangerous. Historians later examined many photographs taken during the battle and found that they documented not only the physical destruction of the city, but also the psychological shift taking place among German forces. The Battle of Stalingrad would ultimately end in one of the most devastating defeats in German military history. In February 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered after being surrounded by Soviet forces during the winter counteroffensive. The image of soldiers standing among the ruins therefore came to represent a moment when the momentum of the war was beginning to change. What had started as a campaign of conquest was slowly becoming a desperate struggle for survival. Another photograph taken the following year would become one of the most recognizable and haunting images associated with the Holocaust. The picture was captured during the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943 and shows a young boy standing among a group of civilians with his hands raised while armed soldiers surround them. The child's frightened expression and small frame quickly made the image one of the most powerful symbols of civilian suffering during the war. At first glance, the photograph appears to document a moment of surrender as residents of the ghetto were forced out of hiding by German forces. Yet historians later discovered that the image had originally been included in a report compiled by German authorities to document the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. The report was intended to demonstrate the success of the operation and to show that the German units had regained control of the area. Instead, the photograph became one of the most widely recognized images illustrating the human cost of Nazi persecution. Over time, the image began appearing in textbooks, museums, and historical exhibitions around the world. Researchers studying the photograph attempted to identify the individuals captured in the frame and to reconstruct the events surrounding that moment. While many details remain uncertain, the photograph's emotional impact remains unmistakable. It reveals how a single image can capture the vulnerability of civilians trapped inside a much larger conflict. For historians, the Warsaw Ghetto photograph represents more than a historical document. It stands as a reminder that behind every statistic of war were individual lives shaped by fear, violence, and survival. Together with the photographs from Stalingrad, it illustrates how images from World War II continue to shape the way we understand the realities of the conflict decades after the fighting ended. In the summer of 1944, one of the most extraordinary photographs of the entire war was taken in secret inside the Auschwitz concentration camp. Unlike the carefully controlled images produced by Nazi authorities, these photographs were created by prisoners themselves under extremely dangerous conditions. Members of a group known as the Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to work near the cremation facilities, managed to smuggle a small camera into the camp and secretly capture several images of what was happening inside the extermination complex. The photographs were taken quickly and under enormous risk, often from hidden positions where the photographer could not fully see what the camera was capturing. As a result, the images appear blurred and partially framed by shadows or obstacles. Yet, despite their imperfect composition, they became some of the most important visual evidence of the Holocaust ever recorded. In one of the photographs, figures can be seen near the cremation pits where bodies were being burned. In another, prisoners are visible in an open clearing, surrounded by guards and fences. These images were later smuggled out of the camp and eventually preserved by resistance networks. For decades, historians debated their authenticity and context, but detailed research confirmed that they were genuine photographs taken during the operation of the camp. Their importance lies not only in what they show, but also in how they were taken. The fact that prisoners themselves risked their lives to document the reality of the camp created a rare form of testimony from inside a place designed to erase evidence of its crimes. Today, these photographs are considered among the most powerful visual records of the Holocaust because they represent a direct act of resistance against a system that attempted to hide its atrocities from the world. Around the same time, another set of photographs was being captured on the beaches of Normandy that would become some of the most famous war images ever taken. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history as they landed along the coast of German-occupied France. Among the soldiers arriving on Omaha Beach was war photographer Robert Capa, who carried his camera alongside the advancing troops as they came under heavy German fire. In the chaos of the landing, Capa managed to take a series of photographs that showed American soldiers struggling through the surf while explosions and machine gun fire erupted around them. The images were blurred and grainy, partly because of the movement and partly because many of the original negatives were damaged during development. Yet this imperfection gave the photographs an extraordinary sense of immediacy. Instead of presenting a composed or staged image, the pictures captured the confusion and danger of the moment itself. Soldiers crouched behind obstacles, waves crashed against landing craft, and smoke drifted across the beach as men attempted to advance under intense fire. These photographs quickly became some of the most iconic visual records of the Allied invasion of Europe. For historians, they provided a rare perspective of what the landing actually looked like from the viewpoint of the soldiers on the ground. Rather than heroic poses or clear battle formations, the images revealed the chaotic and uncertain reality faced by troops during the first moments of the assault. Together with the secret photographs from Auschwitz, the Normandy images demonstrated how powerful visual evidence could shape the world's understanding of World War II. One set of images exposed crimes that the perpetrators tried to conceal, while the other revealed the brutal reality behind one of the most decisive military operations of the entire conflict. By late 1944, the balance of the war had shifted dramatically, and a series of photographs taken inside German military headquarters captured a rare glimpse of the leadership struggling to understand the scale of the crisis unfolding around them. One of the most widely circulated images from this period shows the German war leadership gathered around a large map table while studying the rapidly collapsing front lines in Eastern Europe. The photograph appears, at first glance, similar to many wartime briefing images: officers standing closely together, maps covered with arrows and markings, and an atmosphere of intense concentration. Yet historians who later studied photographs from these meetings noticed subtle but important differences compared to earlier images from the war. In earlier years, German leadership photographs often showed confident officers standing upright, discussing plans during periods when the German army was advancing across Europe. By contrast, images from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a far more tense environment. Faces appear strained, the posture of the officers is more rigid, and the maps themselves show the reality of the situation. Large sections of territory that had once been under German control were now marked with arrows indicating Soviet and Allied advances. These photographs became historically significant because they documented a moment when Germany's leadership was confronting the consequences of multiple military disasters at once. In the East, the Red Army had shattered the German front during massive offensives and was pushing steadily toward the borders of Germany itself. In the West, Allied forces had broken out from Normandy and were advancing across France toward the German frontier. The war that had once been fought across distant territories was now closing in on Germany from both directions. The photographs taken inside these command meetings captured an atmosphere of growing urgency as military leaders attempted to reorganize defenses and slow the Allied advance. For historians, the images serve as a visual record of the moment when the German leadership began to understand that the war was entering its final and most dangerous phase. Around the same time, another photograph began circulating that would eventually become one of the most iconic images marking the end of the war in Europe. In May 1945, as Soviet forces completed the final assault on Berlin, a photographer captured the moment when Soviet soldiers raised their flag above the ruins of the Reichstag building. The image shows several soldiers standing on the damaged structure while the Soviet banner waves above the devastated city. Smoke rises from the shattered buildings below, and the surrounding landscape reveals the enormous destruction caused by weeks of intense fighting. At the time the photograph was taken, Berlin had already endured one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire war. Soviet troops had fought their way street by street through the German capital, while German defenders attempted to slow the advance. When the Reichstag was finally captured, raising the Soviet flag above the building became a powerful symbol of victory for the Soviet Union. The photograph quickly spread across newspapers and magazines around the world, becoming one of the defining images of the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Historians later discovered that the image had been carefully staged shortly after the building was captured to ensure that the moment was properly documented. Yet even with this staging, the photograph retained enormous historical importance. It represented the collapse of the regime that had dominated much of Europe only a few years earlier. The ruined city below the flag illustrated the immense cost of the conflict that had engulfed the continent. Together, the images from German war meetings and the raising of the Soviet flag over Berlin show how photographs can capture the final stages of a historical turning point. One reveals the tension and uncertainty within a leadership facing defeat, while the other marks the moment when that defeat became undeniable to the entire world. In the final weeks of the war in Europe, a series of photographs taken by Allied forces revealed scenes that would permanently shape the world's understanding of what had happened during World War II. One of the most powerful sets of images emerged when Allied troops liberated concentration camps across Germany and occupied territories in the spring of 1945. Among the most well-known photographs are those taken during the liberation of Buchenwald. In one striking image, a group of prisoners stands behind a barbed wire fence, their thin faces staring directly into the camera. The photograph was taken only days after American forces reached the camp and discovered thousands of survivors who had endured years of brutal imprisonment. For many, outside the camps, the scale of what had occurred inside them had been difficult to imagine. Rumors and reports had circulated throughout the war, but these photographs provided undeniable visual proof of the system that had operated behind the walls of Nazi-controlled camps. The images quickly spread through newspapers and newsreels around the world. Political leaders and military officials recognized that the photographs would become essential evidence documenting the crimes committed during the war. When the Nuremberg trials began later in 1945, photographs from liberated camps were presented alongside testimony and documents to demonstrate the scale of the atrocities carried out under Nazi rule. For historians, the photographs taken during these liberations represent one of the most important visual records of the entire conflict. They show not only the victims who survived, but also the moment when the hidden reality of the camps was finally revealed to the outside world. The images forced millions of people to confront the consequences of the war in a way that written reports alone never could. At nearly the same moment, another set of photographs captured the physical end of the regime that had begun the war. After the battle for Berlin ended in May 1945, photographers documented the ruins of the German capital and the remains of the government structures that had once directed the war. Among the most striking images were photographs taken near the entrance to the underground bunker complex, where the German leadership had spent the final weeks of the conflict. In these pictures, soldiers stand among shattered concrete, twisted metal, and piles of rubble marking the destroyed entrance to the bunker. Only a short time earlier, the complex beneath that location had served as the command center for the final decisions of the war. Now it had become another ruin in a city devastated by months of bombing and weeks of intense street fighting. These photographs gained historical importance because they symbolized the collapse of a regime that had once seemed unstoppable. Just 5 years earlier, images of triumphant German troops marching through conquered capitals had filled newspapers across Europe. By 1945, the photographs told a very different story. The bunker ruins stood as physical evidence of how quickly the fortunes of war could change. For historians, these final images provide a visual conclusion to the conflict that began with scenes of conquest and expansion. The photographs taken at the end of the war reveal a continent transformed by years of violence and destruction. They remind us that behind every photograph from World War II lies a deeper story about how the war unfolded and how its consequences continue to shape our understanding of history today.